Hi, welcome. This is basic level design theory that we'll be talking about today. Alright, today we're going to talk about what makes the level fun. We're going to talk about player ergonomics, no learning by death. Level flow, where we keep the player moving. Rhythm, creating a roller coaster rather than a highway. And then difficulty, letting the player win, not the designer. We'll also talk about the wow factor, which are some water cooler moments, and we'll describe what those are. We'll talk about hooks, setting your level apart, and then we'll summarize it all up, and we will not be going over the interview with Dreamsmith. So, the high concepts. These concepts are the basic theory of what it takes to create an enjoyable user experience in a level. And a level that looks good will attract players to it, but it won't keep their interest for long if there isn't anything fun for them to do. So our goal as a level designer is to try to make a fun but challenging experience. Considerations when beginning a level: all aspects of the level must be in balance. So we want to balance fun with feasibility. We also want to make players feel like they're in a believable environment, encountering believable situations, and making believable choices. Now remember, when we say believable, we're actually talking about plausible. It doesn't have to be realistic in terms of actual physics and things like that, but it has to be believable in kind of a video game setting. So think about when we jump when your character jumps in your real-time game engine, and they jump pretty high, 6-8 feet, and even though we can't do that in real life, we can do that in the video game, and we say that that's believable or plausible. So what makes the level fun? Fun is instinctive, so trust your instincts. If you like something that's fun in a video game, chances are that there's many other people, thousands, maybe even millions of people that like the exact same fun thing that you like. So here's an example. If you were just to get in a stance and you run forward and then you run backward and then you stop and then you run to the side, you run to the other side, you stop, you run diagonally, and you do all these things, does that sound like any fun? For most people, no, that doesn't sound like fun at all. But what if we added a few things? If we had a ball, if we had a couple players, if we had some rackets, and we had a court and things like that, now you're doing those exact same motions, but now you have a game called tennis, and it's actually fun. So that's kind of the thing we're looking for, is doing actions, doing motions, doing interactive things, but it's our job as the level designer to add an element of fun to them. So here's some universal concepts in level design that we're going to take a look at today. Ergonomics, you've probably heard that word before when thinking about chairs and furniture. And so we'll talk about what does that mean in level design. What is level design ergonomics? We'll talk about flow, rhythm, difficulty, the wow factor, and we'll talk about hooks. So here's player ergonomics, which means for us, no learning by death. Always keep the player in mind. If a level contains areas frustrating to the player, it will reduce the overall experience. So by that, we want to keep areas from being frustrating, and we don't want them to rage quit our game, right? No, we don't want that to happen. So we don't want the overall experience to be reduced to frustration. We want them to have fun, but yet have it be challenging. So our job as level designer is to identify possible areas of frustration, address them, and then make them a non-issue. So we're taking away areas of frustration while putting fun things to do in our game. Here's an example of bad ergonomics. A level designer blocking some part of a map by a never-ending stream of enemies. Think about it. If the player is in a room and the only way out is through a door, but there's a never-ending stream of enemies coming through the door, how am I ever going to get out of this room? That can be frustrating. So after dying a few times, the player will realize he just can't leave yet and will be forced to finish his objectives. So at this point, the player will be throwing their console at the wall, right? We don't want that to happen. No rage quits. This is why play testing and QA are vitally important. As you gain experience as a level designer, you'll gain greater ability to see your level through the player's eyes. You should anticipate or isolate spots where the player may become frustrated, and then make sure someone else plays your level. You want to get other eyes on it so that they can give you feedback, because as a level designer, you're going to be looking at your level for many hours a day, probably every day for weeks. You get to see things and things just become normal to you, and a texture that may be out of place becomes normal looking to you and you don't see it. So you've got to get other people's eyes on your level to give you feedback. Many times in the industry, when there are multiple level designers, after a while or after weeks of working on the same level, level designers will swap levels, and so you'll be working on someone else's level, and they'll be working on your level, and that's a good way to get new eyes and fresh eyes. And as a level designer, you shouldn't think, but wait, that's my work, I don't want anybody touching it. That's not really the way it works. Level design is a team effort, usually, especially in bigger companies, and multiple people are going to touch the level and be able to call it their own. So usually it's not the case of just one person working on a level all by themselves and you could call it, that's my level. It doesn't really work like that. It's a team effort. Here are some hard and fast rules. You should allow the player to save and reload. Allowing them to save frequently is a good thing. Allow them to recharge and restock after major encounters. Think about this. How many times have you come to the end of a level, you beat the mini boss, but you have like one bullet left in your gun, right? And then you get to the next level and you're just fighting some minion, it doesn't even matter. They hit you once and you die because maybe you have one health left or you've only got one bullet and there were more enemies to deal with than you had. So after each level, allow the player to recharge and restock. Don't force the player to replay the level many times from the beginning. Give them a chance to succeed. Give them a chance to have some start points, save points that are throughout the game. We don't want them to continue to go back to the beginning. How would you like it if there was a game that took 20 hours to play, you get through 5 hours of it, you lose all your lives, health, and then you have to go back to the beginning and replay those 5 hours over and over again until you can get all the way through the game. That doesn't sound like a lot of fun. So give the player a chance to succeed. Give them a choice to recharge or not. Don't make it automatic. Give them the choice. Here's some more hard and fast rules. Give clues. Don't let the players get lost. So what do we mean by that? So if they're in a dark room or a dark area, put a light somewhere because people are drawn to that contrast of a bright light in a dark area. And the converse of that is that what if they're in a very bright area and they don't know where to go? Give them a dark area or maybe a flashing light, something that shows that, hey, I'm over here, come look at me. So avoid at all costs putting a simple maze in your map thinking it will be challenging to the player. Solving puzzles by trial and error is frustrating. If you're going to give them a simple maze, perhaps give them some clues to help them get out of there. Some people just don't like mazes or they're not good at them. So even a simple maze can be frustrating. Give them information to get through a maze without blatantly telling them. Maybe they have to solve puzzles to earn clues that will help get them through the maze. And lastly, be aware of the player's comfort level. Allow for a learning curve. Let them get comfortable with the controls before giving them difficult enemies. And I'm going to add another one. When you give them really cool weapons, give them a chance, maybe a tutorial level or a practice level where they get to learn the controls of the gun and they learn to get good at it before having to battle with a mini boss or a boss. So let the player have opportunity to test out the things that you've given them, the tools and the skills, and let them build up to them so that they can have better challenges later. Level flow. Keep the player moving. So we want to avoid disconnects. When the player reaches a point in the game where they are suddenly dumped back into the real world, that's a disconnect. And we don't want them to do that. We want the player focused on the screen. We want them to go in the screen and focus on where they are inside the game. They shouldn't be thinking about the chair they're sitting in, the walls, the room. They shouldn't even be thinking about the fact that they're looking at a screen. The player should feel like they're actually in the game playing. What happens is where the game goes from fun to tedious is when the levels flow breaks down, and we don't want that to happen. So make sure that you always keep the game interesting for the player. Now, that feeling where the player gets dumped out of the game and back into reality is called dissonance. Or dissonance is actually what causes that. And so we need this importance of believability. The level designer is the invisible hand guiding the player through each environment in a game. You push them to go through a certain doorway, or you pull them along by using lighting, sound effects, item placement, things like that. You can probably think of even more things to use that might help guide the player, where you're either pushing them along or you're pulling them along. Here's an example. What if I want the player to go forward, but the player just kind of wants to hang out where they are? Well, if I want them to go forward, maybe I'll put some type of I'll put alligators behind them, that if they don't move forward, the alligators will start biting their heels, their legs, and maybe take some of their health away. So that would force them to move forward, okay? So think about things that you can do. I remember in the Hunger Games movie, if you'll remember, there were times when the game master would do things like they had the poison fog that one time because they wanted the players in the Hunger Games to move from their current location down to a different area. So they created poison fog, and if they stayed in it, they would die, but if they would move, they could be saved. And it's that kind of idea that we're looking at. Give the player a little bit of a nip, sometimes on their heels, in order to get them moving forward. Other things for pulling the player along, maybe offer them rewards as well as lights, sound effects, and things like that. Dissonance, the feeling that something is out of place, and it can be used to create tension and uneasiness, but you want to avoid too many irrelevant action sequences. So what happens is usually with new level designers, I try to recommend avoiding dissonance in the levels at all until you've learned to use it correctly. And so it can be used to create tension and uneasiness because that's kind of what it does. What if here we are, it's 2021, we all have cell phones that make little beeps and things like that, but what if all of a sudden I hear ring? And that's not something that normally happens with our cell phones. That's an old school phone ringing is what it is. And so that would be a little bit different than what we're used to hearing today. And so that can be used to create tension, uneasiness. It can kind of set up the player's alarm a little bit, or make them alert of that something's going on here. Something's not right. And so dissonance can be used to your advantage as a level designer. Now, the next thing, the constant danger of boredom. Don't assume that boredom is only caused when the player isn't doing enough to be entertained. There's actually a lot of causes of boredom. Some other causes are repetition of elements. Think about this. If the example I gave earlier, when you're in a room and there's just a constant stream of enemies coming at you, but also that's one way of getting bored. But what if you have the same type or same kind of enemies that are always attacking you? It might be nice to have a variety of different enemies, a variety of different types of challenges. That helps keep things interesting. So our key word here is going to be variety. Variety prevents boredom. Another thing that causes boredom is keeping your finger on the trigger the entire time. If you're just putting your finger on the trigger and holding it down all the time, then your finger can become fatigued, your hand, because you're clenching. And this is, we might be talking about minutes for some people, but we could be talking about tens of minutes, 30 minutes, half hours going by at a time. Other things are things that may be exciting at first, but then they have a short attention span. And so characters that are kind of fun to hang around because they're engaging and they're talking with us, but sometimes if they don't stop talking, they can become annoying, and we can just be tired of them. Some other things of boredom. Mental boredom. This comes from seeing the same things over and over again. Think about if you've ever driven down a very long road for an hour or longer and all you see are trees and fields, and how sometimes your mind starts to wander, or you're listening to music or a talk show or a podcast, and then all of a sudden 45 minutes are gone and you don't remember driving or anything that you've seen, because you're kind of checking out your boredom, because there's nothing really to look at. There's no billboards. There's nothing different. It's just trees, trees, trees. Mental boredom also comes from hearing the same sounds and music over and over again. Again, we're talking about variation, even in the sounds and music. And then playing the same gameplay over and over can also cause boredom. So again, we want to add variation to our gameplay. What about physical boredom? Well, if there's a lack of interaction or physical movement, if all the player is doing there is just standing around, that can become boring. If all they're doing is holding down one key for long periods of time, that can be boring. Or they'll become disengaged when the player is aware of being uncomfortable where they are sitting. We don't want that at all, because the moment the player realizes that, oh, this chair is uncomfortable, and they start moving around, that's when they're most likely to put the game controller down and walk away and maybe not come back at all. So we don't want the player to realize that they've been sitting in a chair for a very long time. How do we prevent boredom? Well, we can drive the player ahead using subtle temptation. So provide some type of potential rewards, some benefits, some new skills, something to almost bribe the player ahead. And also give them direction. Let them know where it is that you want them to go. And sometimes you can be as blunt as like putting an arrow or a flashing arrow somewhere. And the threat of a painful bite if it's not done right. And we talked earlier about maybe an alligator nipping at the heels if you want the player to move forward. Little things like that can be a lot of fun if you're running from something that's chasing you. And you can also use a combination of any of these elements, or maybe you'll come up with some of your own. Some other ideas are illuminated doorways, unusual sounds, explosions happening behind them. In any case, keep the flow moving. That's the idea. Keep the flow moving, keep the player moving. Now, let's talk about rhythm, because when we create our levels, we want to create rhythm. So the idea is that we want to create a roller coaster rather than a highway. Rhythm is a way of expressing the pattern, frequency, and intensity of the sequences of events in a level. It's used to draw the audience in, to set up expectations, and then deliver surprises. You should provide a roller coaster of experiences as a level designer. Let's take a look at a graph of how this might look in our levels. So here's a rhythm graph. And think about this. If this was one level, we might have a really fun experience at the beginning of the level for the player. And that's where this first hump or hill comes from. And then we give them a little bit of downtime to breathe and catch their breath. And then we give them another really fun experience here. Maybe they're battling a mini boss all of a sudden. And then they come down, we allow them to rest and recharge, restock, reload. And then we've got another little fun experience for them. And then another bigger one. Maybe it's another mini boss experience. And then we give them a huge drop all the way down a little bit where the player gets to catch their breath, and maybe they're getting some information during this time. It's not a battle, but it's some information during this time when they've got some downtime. But then there's a really big fun experience that happens after that, and then again towards the end. So this could be used for a single level, or this could even be used as different levels in a game. Think about that. Each one of these peaks, just after it, or at the downturn, that's where the level ends and the next one begins. Each one of these. So here we could see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 levels represented right here, with a more fun experience with each one, except for that little dip right there. Maybe that's one where they're learning a new skill. It's a tutorial level. You've given them a new weapon, and you're allowing them to test it there. So what about level rhythm? Level rhythm. Don't try to plot the rhythm of your level in so much detail that you're afraid to change it. You should be aware of the overall rhythm of your map, and you'll have to make rhythm charts like we saw just before and plot it out. How do you want the player to have fun? Think about their heartbeat. You want to get their heart beating fast and maybe even get sweaty palms, right? And then give them a moment to come down, catch their breath, maybe blink a little bit, let their palms dry out, let their heartbeat slow down a little bit, and then give them another great heart-pounding experience. So be aware of the rhythm of the map. Write down those key moments and pivotal experiences in sequence. What fun things are you giving them to do in the level? You'll have to write them down. So in doing that, we could write down a cell diagram. So let's take a look at what is a cell diagram. A cell diagram has an introduction, and then it's got an arrow pointing to the next fun thing. Well, in this case, there's a launch sequence, and then it goes to the flight to waypoint, and this is a downtime. This is when instead of a hill, this is a valley. And then an ambush, so that's a really fun one with a good challenge to it. And then the player versus the light fighters, and then contact from a cruise ship. The player is getting information, and they're chatting, they're talking, so it's another downtime. Then the cruiser is destroyed, so there's another battle. Then the battleships face off, and then you're either going to have success, and you'll see an outro, a little short movie of success, or failure. You'll see a little example of failing, maybe dying, or if it's a battleship crashing into an asteroid or something. But these are the things. This is a cell diagram to kind of highlight. And it doesn't have to be in a square like this. You could make it linear as well, starting from left and going off to the right. So hold on for a moment. All right, and the next one, aesthetic rhythm. The look and mood of the levels should flow along with the gameplay. So we want to avoid dissonance. We talked about dissonance just a while ago. We want to avoid it, like I said, but when used properly, it can be used to great effect. So let's avoid drastic changes in textures, models, lighting styles, or shifts in quality. And an example of that, here's some examples. When the walls of a corridor shift from metal plating to rubber padding. That's a pretty drastic shift in sound and in textures and actually in feel. What about when walls change from being a natural rocky texture to a man-made smooth surface? And then changing the color of lights without cause. What about, so make sure to have a good reason for making these changes. Otherwise, it is a moment of awakening and dissonance occurs. So we want to avoid that unless we're doing it with the real purpose. What about some shifts in quality? So these can occur because level design is an iterative process. And think about this. When the game first starts, when you first start developing it, the first couple months you're very excited. It's something new. You're digging in and you're working hard. And so everything looks really amazing, really fun, and you're putting as much as you can into those first few levels that you're working on. But what happens is that as you get into the months and months and months of working on the same levels and building, and you're getting to the end of the development cycle, and your excitement may not be there as much anymore as it was at the beginning when it was fresh and new, right? So sometimes your artwork, the quality can suffer a little bit. So start designing your level anywhere but the start. Meaning, don't work on levels 1, 2, and 3 right away. What if we have 40 levels in a game? Just pick randomly some levels where you're going to begin. Maybe I'll start with level 9, and then I'll move to 18, and I'll move to 23 and 36, and you'll make all these different levels, and that way, the quality will be dispersed throughout the game, and it will just look again like maybe up and down quality-wise, but we're not trying to say that we want poor quality. We're just saying that some of it may be much better or a little better because of excitement and tiredness and weariness and things like that over months and months and months of working on the same thing. But always deliver a consistent effort in your design, in your implementation. And we're not saying that that we're planning to have lower quality. Sometimes it's just a natural thing that happens, unfortunately. Now, what about difficulty in level design as far as how do we handle that with our player? Well, let's let the player win, not the designer. So what I mean by that is that as a level designer, you're not thinking, I'm going to build a level so difficult nobody will ever be able to win it or pass it or beat it. That's not what we're really doing. As a level designer, you are the player's advocate, which means you're trying to help them have a challenging and fun experience. So every game has a different difficulty curve. Each level has its own difficulty curve, but make sure that the player is having fun during all of this time of being difficult, okay? Again, we don't want the player rage quitting. We don't want them putting down their console, their controller, and we just don't want that happening at all. Now, what does difficulty look like, and how do we plan for it? So here is a simple difficulty curve. A game level that simply gets harder the more you play is not really delivering on what makes games so different from other mediums. Interactivity and being able to respond to the individual actions of the player, that's what makes things fun. Okay? So here's a simple difficulty curve. It looks like to me it starts off very easy over time, and then as they play, it gets increasingly difficult. And then here we are about the middle of the game. And then as we get towards the end of the game, it just gets ridiculously difficult towards the end. And we've left all this space out here for the player to have more fun with some difficulty up here, and we didn't provide that for them. So let's try not to have simple difficulty curves. So what do we recommend then? What's better than this? Here's an example. We could have a complex difficulty wave. So this means that variations in difficulty will provide a more interesting experience for the player. So if you look here, it starts off, and instead of starting so easily and staying easy for a long time, we want to give the player some more challenges. So we add a little bit of difficulty at the beginning. We challenge them, and then it plateaus where the player gets to breathe again, and they get to get prepared for the next challenge that they go up. And this just continues to happen throughout all of the different levels that we give them until the end. The player has got the same tough challenge, but this time they're prepared for it. Instead of having that steep learning curve, they've been preparing for the final battle all along. That's the idea behind it. Now, this is a difficulty wave for an entire game, but what about for a single level? So here's one that's similar to the other ones that we've looked at, and if you'll notice, there's always the ups and downs, and that's what we're really trying to achieve here. Think about in the movies when they do this, right? Indiana Jones, it started with like he's walking through a cave, and he's experiencing some challenges, maybe some things that could take his life. And then he finally finds the golden idol, and then the earthquake begins, right? And that's when, earthquake, and this big, huge rock, this round rock is chasing him and everything. And then the Aborigines chase him, and they're shooting poison darts at him. Then he gets in his airplane and flies away. And then we can breathe, and there's some downtime. And then something else happens, and Indiana Jones is on another adventure, and then downtime. And it just keeps happening like that over and over. So we're still looking for that roller coaster ride, even within our level. Now, how do we control difficulty? Well, here's some examples of controlling difficulty. We can distribute resources So we get to determine as the level designer, how much and where is the ammunition and the weapons, pickups, and things like that, right? And we can also distribute opposing forces, the challenges, the enemies, and the obstacles and their properties. And then again, we can also determine how are we going to distribute clues to the player as well, and even puzzles and games and things like that within the level. So what about some player character penalties? Well, these can slow the player down by using water, uneven terrain, maybe just some minor enemies that kind of slow them down and get in their way, maybe lack of resources, so the player has to look around a little bit. So there's ways of forcing the player to either speed up or slow down, and it can increase the level of difficulty there. What about doing it dynamically within the game? So here's some dynamic difficulty adjustments. We can do it organically, where the overall difficulty graph increases or decreases according to how well the player is doing. And this is something that's come around in the last, about 15, 20 years or so, where games now can organically determine how well the player is doing fighting the enemies, overcoming the obstacles, and then the game can adjust accordingly to how well the player is doing. The benefits are that the player should be able to progress through the game without having to replay too much of any particular system. So that's the idea behind it. And programmers, that's a programmer's job to be able to get this organic change in difficulty throughout the game. And the cool thing is, the player never even realizes that it's happening to them. Unless you're kind of geared into that, you wouldn't even know it. You just think, the game's becoming easier for me. Maybe I'm just getting better at it. Let's talk a little bit about the wow factor, meaning these water cooler moments. What are these? It's where people are so impressed they'll be talking about it around the cooler after they've played it. So that's how you know you're doing well as or as a level designer, is that people are actually talking about the really cool things you put in the level. The cool fun things, the cool challenges, the enemies, the obstacles, weapons, pickups, all those things are really fun to have in the game and to overcome. So they could also come from other aspects of the level, the architecture. How nice do the models look? Is it something unusual that we haven't seen before? What about special effects, audio? There's so many different things that we get to put in there that could really make it interesting. Things we haven't seen before. One of the best things that comes to mind in Hollywood movies, remember bullet time from The Matrix? That's like one of the coolest things. Is bullet time, where they kind of slow the camera down and you get to see, the bullets going through across the screen, and you see the little circles that they're making, like sound waves coming out. That was one of the coolest special effects that Hollywood's put out, and it's been very memorable. And so there's a lot of things like that in video games as well. What about a challenging mechanic or an ingenious puzzle? These things should leave an impression on the player, and the level should have a few of these moments in all your levels. So you want to start thinking, you want to keep a notebook. This is what I recommend. Keep a notebook, and then every time you come up with some creative idea for a challenge, an obstacle, a puzzle, something like that, write it down. And in your notebook, see, I've got a notebook here, and I keep my notes in my notebook. It's just unlined paper, and I love to keep my notes in there. Whenever I come up with an idea, I'm writing it down in there, and that way, when I'm building a level, I can take that really cool idea and see if it fits the level I'm putting it in. And if you constantly do this, you'll have a notebook full of very fun and challenging experiences that you can add into your levels, and you won't always have to be making them up on the fly. So you can plan for them. Here's an example of a wow factor moment right here. This is the game God of War, and this is a boss character right here. And there's Kratos down there, and Kratos is kind of a big guy, but not when compared with this really large creature right here. And look, he's got little pointy thorns all over his head and his neck and his body. He's got really sharp teeth. He's got evil eyes. He's got legs like an octopus or a squid. He's got suckers on him, and then he's even got, looks like bites taken out of his flesh here, where he was doing battle with something, and apparently he won because he's still alive. But whatever he's doing battle with, it took a couple bites out of him, but that thing probably lost. And so anyway, he looks like a really tough character. And so this would be one of those wow moments that people would talk about the next day, is this boss battle. Now, what about hooks? We've talked about making our game memorable, and a lot of times doing that means putting a hook into your game. So setting your level apart. This is going to be some unique or must-have feature that will attract players simply because they haven't experienced anything like it before. Give the player incentive to purchase the game. Think about it. How many times have you played a game where there was some really cool feature or something in it and you told your friends about it and then they went out and bought the game, right? That's how these things happen, and that's how games go viral, is because somebody plays it, they enjoy it so much they tell their friends, and then they go and play it and they tell their friends, and before you know it, millions of people have downloaded or bought the game and played it and had that same fun experience. What are some examples of hooks? Well, let's talk about these. I put a couple in here. In God of War, which is one of my favorite games, God of War, swinging around the knives in battle to defeat the enemies. Kratos has these knives and keeps them on chains, and he swings these things around, and then he cuts his enemies with them. And so it's kind of fun to do that. It's kind of a fun way. Think about in Gears of War, the chainsaw bayonet, where you get to take it and you're sawing the horde in half, right? Or sawing the characters. And then Portal, just the use of portals themselves are really great examples of hooks. They really came up with a neat feature, a great design, and built an entire game around it, or several games, with the use of portals. And that was pretty ingenious. And there's probably many others that you can think of as well. So we've talked about, all these different things that we can put into our levels to make them fun and challenging and give the player a variety. So in summary, fun is a subjective word, and just because, when you think something's fun, there's probably thousands of other people that think the same thing is fun that you do, but sometimes the things that you think of fun, other people may not think are fun. And that's why it's subjective. And you kind of have to think about what is our target player who's going to play our game, and what do they think is fun. So there's really no strict formula for fun, but you just have to do it based on your experience. Make the level enjoyable. You have to juggle many elements, add variety, and remember the high concept factors we talked about: ergonomics, flow, rhythm, difficulty, impression, and hooks. So remember these high concept factors. Ergonomics is making sure the player is not frustrated in play. Flow is keeping the player moving through the playfield. Rhythm, providing a spread of intensity and experience to motivate the player. Difficulty means keeping the player challenged. Impression, that's the wow factor, introducing the element of awe at key moments. And then hooks, making your level stand out to the player as different from the others. So these are all things that you can start thinking of. Get yourself a notebook and start making notes of all these different fun, challenging things that you can add into your levels as a level designer. So that's it for today. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.